Thank you so much, Hezron. So thank you everyone for joining in and for the number of participants that we've had continuously. It's a pleasure to know that at least the information that we share, the kind of insights we look into are making an impact and making you want to know more. And the most important bit would be if we are applying that knowledge. So as introduced by Hezron Munyakin, my co-host for the session, I'm Odhiambo David. I am a pharmacist by profession, currently doing my internship. And other than that, I also run an organization, the Agriculture, Health and Social Innovation, and I'm affiliated to a number of organizations at the moment. So aligned to what we are going to look into today, our topic is on health workforce, fixing the human resources for health tools. HRHR is one of the components of the health system pillars out of the 6 of them. So in this particular component, we are looking at it in terms of how do we ensure people have access to quality healthcare services when they need them, where they need them, from qualified individuals who are competent, motivated enough, and able to deliver the quality care without putting patients at risk, one. And other than just putting patients at risk, they are also able to prevent health component, health behavior, like influence social behavior change, influence positive health outcomes at whichever level that they are involved. Because when you look at it in terms of health, we start from the preventive health promotion, we go to curative, rehabilitative, and palliative component of healthcare services. So the main critical thing is, how do we ensure we have the competent health workforce in adequate numbers so that they be able to offer the services when and where they are needed? So that is a very critical thing. And at this point in time, the reason as to why we had this session is because we realized we have concerns as a country, we have concerns as individuals, and these concerns are affecting us because there are certain decisions that are being made by individuals which will affect how we access the services we need or how we fail to access them as members of the public. And as you're going to start this session, the first thing that I want us to look into is, one, look at healthcare workers as human beings before they are doctors. As a pharmacist, I mentioned that I'm a pharmacist. There are a number of people who introduce themselves. We have a lecturer, we have a retired doctor, and all these people are human beings before they become professionals in their field of work. So when we're looking at them, we look at them and see their needs as human beings before we move to the aspect of being doctors. Then within the vocation where they were practiced as professionals, you look at it in terms of how do they be in the best state of mind as a human being to be able to perform their roles and their responsibilities that will be enabling them to give you what you need as a patient, as a member of the public, and as an individual. So that is a very critical component that we have to look at. So as we get into the session, the most important bit, as I mentioned, HRH is part of the health system pillars that we have. And as a health system pillar, it's indicated that the ability of a country to meet its health goals depends on the knowledge, skills, motivation, and deployment of people responsible for organizing and delivering health services. And these are the health workforce. So do you have the right knowledge and the right skills? Then if the health worker has the right knowledge and the right skills, and when we look at it, for this one, we'll be looking at people who have the medical background offering medical related, clinical, or any medical services within the health setup. But in the general term on human resources for health, we have to look at the person who, the accountant who manages the finances of the institution in terms of managing cost, billing, and all. We have to look at the cleaner who ensures the hospital is clean. If people within the room understand the component of like the nosocomial infection, the risk of being infected within a hospital setting, the cleaner has the responsibility to ensure the risk of those infections are limited by using the right detergents, which they have to know how the detergents have that capability, how they do cleaning, how do they ensure the patients are adhering to safety measures and precautionary measures. And even at this point now, when we have COVID-19, we acknowledge the responsibility of all these people within the healthcare setup as a very critical role. And it has an influence on the quality of outcomes that we can realize and the efficiency and the functionality of these hospitals where they work. So the question is, are we going to enable them do the work, or we are not going to enable them? And if we don't enable them, what are the implications? What are the costs to our healthcare services? So there's a direct correlation between the number of healthcare workers and the population of the country or the region that we're looking at, and the health outcomes of these people. So for example, in the recent case, we've had community health workers being championed for. As community health workers, what we look at is, are they able to reach out to community, identify risk factors in those community, let's say, for example, immunization, uptake levels. So these are very important factors that are normally considered for the community health workers, CHWs. Then we look at it, another thing was, initially before the realization that maternal health was a complicated issue, I believe Sadia would concur with me on this, a number of issues affected safe delivery for mothers, access to qualified and skilled birth attendants. Normally we had the traditional birth attendants or the traditional healers in the community setting that would help women to deliver. Some of the times there were complications, and because of the limited knowledge and the limited skill on how to do it, now with advances, these have been responded to. And the advantages have been made because, one, there's knowledge and skills that have been imparted on these people. Two, we have the aspect on numbers being more of them being trained. So when we have more traditional about the healthcare workers within the communities who can help as midwives, then the outcomes in terms of delivery, maternal, like the maternal complications at delivery will be reduced. So those are benefits of having numbers and the skills that are in place. Now the other factor would be, are they motivated, or are they able to fend for their other needs? Because as individuals, the reason as why I started from the point that we are human beings before we become healthcare workers. So we have responsibility, we have obligations to meet in the very society where we live. So are we able to cater for these other needs? If we are, then we would be more willing to offer extra services, and even if not extra, at the best level possible where we are delivering it, so that everybody wins in the whole arrangement. So those are some of the things that we have to have in mind when we're looking at the HRH issues on health. Then according to the from the WHO, there was an establishment of the Global Strategy on Human Resources for Health Workforce 2030. So this was aimed at looking at the human resources health workforce shortfalls, the measures that could be adopted to ensure we are able to realize our aspirations as a world and in different countries. So with that, it was a matter of doing metrics and looking at what shortfalls do we have. And at that point, there was the WHO standard of the human, like the population to doctor-patient ratio. That was 1 to 1,000. So for the Kenyan case, we have a ratio of 1 to 16,000 or 17,000 thereabout, because we have a lesser people who are trained to offer the medical services that we need. And even these statistics might not be the actual depiction of what really happens in our context. Reason being, these were based on the number of trained doctors in the country. We have trained doctors. And then we look at it in terms of interaction with patients. Some have left the country. Some are within the country but have repurposed and done some other things that might not be enabling them to. They're not majorly involved in care delivery. So how that is not now going to have a difference in the ratio that we're talking about. Because for example, if I'm a doctor and I'm not practicing medicine, I'm in another field, then I'm not part of the ratio that we should be considering as patient interaction with a doctor. So that is a different phase altogether. So from this, there was the reporting mechanism through the Global Health Observatory Data Repository System, where every country reports in terms of which people, how many healthcare workers they have, the medical conditions, the interventions that have been addressed. It covers every medical condition that is a risk factor that has been given attention by the WHO. HIV/AIDS is there, antenatal care, maternal mortality, so all the related factors around care delivery. So if we have realized that we have shortfalls in terms of the numbers, one, other than the numbers, are people empowered to deliver on the services they should be delivering? That is another critical bit. So when we looked at it in terms of what are the different gaps that we have, you look at it, the developed countries, some have not hit the target of 1 to 1,000 doctor to patient ratio as required, as standardized by the WHO, while others, especially in the global south, as we nowadays referred, we have a longer way to go. Reason being, we have not met the standard of what is required in terms of the numbers. The ability of these people to deliver the services are also not to the optimal level that it would be required to be. And three, we are at a position where most of our doctors and healthcare workers are localized in the urban and the peri-urban settings. What happens to those in the very rural communities? Which are the people that get to, who gets to attend to the medical needs of those people in those communities? So those are very critical issues that we need to look at as doctors, as people who want to make a difference in the health of our people and health of our society. So in this presentation, the other thing that we looked at was what are the key factors that we have to look at in terms of knowing we have the right numbers, we have the right skill, doctors with the right skills, that is having the capacity to offer the clinical and health related services that they are supposed to be offering. So the numbers, knowledgeable, and they are motivated and empowered to do that work where it's needed. That is, even in the rural areas where there's need for healthcare services, they are able to do that. So the critical issue that we looked at was, one, ability to attract the healthcare workers, to train them, to recruit them. There's a difference between attracting and recruiting. I'll look into that. Then retaining them within the healthcare system, empowering them, remunerating them according to a standard that is agreeable to both parties, motivating them to continue doing the work, and deploying them where and when they are needed, where they are suited to deliver the services. So when we discuss these factors, attracting healthcare workers, we realize that before anybody gets into a medical course or any course that they do, they have to have an interest in it. So what is the driving factor that makes us get into the medical courses that we pursue? I believe me and you both know there is a gap in that aspect, because in the other society, doctors are people who are looked up to. And when they're looked up to, because of the impact they have in the society in terms of the quality of services, the good care that they offer, and they make lives better for the people who really need them. They look out for the vulnerable in the society, the sick. So if that is the case, what are the other factors that make people want to get into medical courses? People believe doctors are rich. Maybe it's true, maybe not, I don't know. Maybe you as an individual, you might get an idea from someone who is a doctor somewhere, or you can talk to professionals within your circle and look at it in terms of, are they really rich and are they happy with what they have? Or if not rich, what are the factors that made them not get to that rich that every other person in the society perceives? So attracting them, how do we ensure that individuals who have interest in pursuing medical courses, offering healthcare services, because that is what the cornerstone of healthcare service delivery, gets to pursue medical courses? Then if they get to pursue medical courses, it means they have to apply through the KUCCPS, or even if it's a parallel programs, we have to enable them. And that is a very commendable thing that I can say a number of organizations have been doing. IntraHealth have a number of engagements. We have Kenya Healthcare Federation. I believe SADI is part of the Kenya Healthcare Federation leadership. And there's work that's going on to ensure that those people who have an interest in pursuing medical courses and doing the work to offer the services are able to be supported to get into training. Then once in school, do they get the right training? How do we ensure that training enables them to meet the healthcare needs of the individuals they are going to interact with? Experiential learning. Are they working where there's a need? Are they being engaged in healthcare services rather than being in the classes where they read a lot of theory? So those are critical components that I feel academicians, as we have some in the room, we have to look at these factors and ask ourselves. For example, Eunice, you mentioned you are an economist and as a lecturer. How do you get your students to look into the economical models of what needs to be done, what are the hindrances to such, and then enabling them be able to deliver the services? Then after being trained, you have graduated from med school, you've graduated from your schooling, you have to be employed. And that is where the recruitment phase starts. Do we recruit the people who are able to offer the quality services? Or if not even recruiting the people who are able to offer, do we recruit the doctors that we've trained? We have a deficit of trained healthcare workers in employment, but at the very same time, few of them are employed. Some are not employed. Like I remember last year, there was a statistic that was presented by the Kenya Medical Practitioners, Pharmacists and Dentists Union that documented that we have over 1,300 untrained, unemployed healthcare workers. So how do we meet that gap? How do we recruit them? Why would you train someone if they're not going to be employed? It's not that there is no need for them. There is a need for them, but we're not employing them. So that is a question that needs to be asked. Other than recruitment, we have to retain them. You recruit them under pathetic conditions, and when I believe all of us can acknowledge we had a mega strike by the doctors in 2017, 2018 early. And at that point, there was an issue, actually 2016 and early 2017. And at that point, we realized that there were shortfalls in the healthcare system, medical equipment, facilities they didn't have. Like even now we have an issue of personal protective equipment. Some doctors have gotten infected in the line of work. So how do we retain them? By ensuring they have the best conditions, that is being empowered and being retained with the healthcare system. Some are not able to be retained because they look at it in terms of, I'm coming to a hospital where patients will be looking up to me to offer the best quality of care, but I don't have the tools of service. I would use my case as a pharmacist. Imagine I'm at a pharmacy somewhere in a hospital where I'm employed to offer my services and I don't have any medicines. And it's not that I don't want to offer them the medicines. The government budgeting procedures are not in line. The medical supplies have an issue and I'm not able to dispense medicines to patients, which I know they can get. So what will I do? I'll be telling them to go buy from the chemist or the pharmacy outside there. The very community will be calling on it like, these pharmacies, probably they have a deal with the community pharmacies that are out there. I'm not saying that such things don't happen. Such things do happen, I know they do. Just that we don't know where exactly they happen. So we have to be part of the difference. We have to ensure that the hospital has the capacity to put in place to ensure that we are empowered. I'm able to do the work and feel like I'm making a service. Because going to a facility and telling people out of stock from morning to evening, and then you go home, do you really deserve even that pay? At that point, I can't be retained in that kind of an employment. I'll move to another place. If I'm moving to another employer, another job setup, the public who needs my services is going to miss. And when that person misses, it's a loss for me as an individual who is not able to offer the services where I wish I could. It's a loss to that person and the family, and it's a loss to the entire economy. When you look at it in the economic model, I think Eunice could tell us more on that. So those are some of the things that we need to look into. The remuneration. Some of the doctors have been leaving the country because we look at in terms of the benefits package, the payment. There's a huge gap from what another organization would be willing to give you and what you're getting at this point. For some of the doctors who are not fully engaged by the government, there are now contracts that are being put into place. And these contracts, you do the same job kind of work with another person who got employed earlier at a third their salary. Yet you are a human being with the same responsibilities, the same qualifications, and you're supposed to do the same kind of work. How do we ensure we retain such people? If you're not being remunerated the best way possible, it won't work. Motivating them. Are there professional development opportunities? Are they given the power to make the right decision when they have to make them? For example, the case that I talked about, not being able to get the medicines that patients need when I'm supposed to be giving them those medicines or even selling for them, but they should be available. Such a decision might be at a level that it's being made by another individual higher in the rank, and you are not able to influence that decision. Are you motivated to work? You don't have the authority. You are a doctor because the patients see you as a doctor, but you don't have the voice to speak up for them because things are not according to how they should be. We need to motivate them. Then deploying them. Are we able to have medical doctors and any other healthcare worker where there should be access to services? In each and every community, there are individuals, there's need for healthcare services, starting from preventive, health promotion, curative, palliative, and rehabilitative healthcare services. So those are the key factors that we consider when you're looking at human resources for health. Are we able to meet all those? If we are able to meet those, then I believe we will be at a better position to achieve the WHO standard. And that is not the goal. The goal is to ensure we have a healthy society. It's just that that kind of a standard that has been put in place enables us to be able to meet that target. It's not the end goal. It is an enabler and a metric that can show that we are getting closer to achieving that target. So we have to look at how to influence all these and ensure patients have access to the right services that they need when they need them. So what are the recent developments in the human resources for health? We had, after the promulgation of the new constitution, decentralization of healthcare to county governments, the 47 of them. Then it's kind of policy-related, policy reform issues, but what is the impact? Governors, some of them are not willing to employ doctors. Some don't have the ability to. So that's another factor. So how do we meet these? There's an altered skill mix in training programs, and that has been witnessed by the adoption of a number of they're kind of short course, not short course, where you have another program that is not internationally recognized or accredited, but it's going to meet our local needs. And a point in case we could look at it in terms of the clinical medicine. There's a clinical medicine degree, a clinical medicine diploma level, and then clinical medicine degree and Bachelor of Medicine and Surgery at a degree level with a difference of only 2 years in the training. And these people kind of do the same kind of work. But internationally, the clinical medicine degree isn't that much acknowledged. Therefore, these are people who can work within the local context because they understand our local context to a far much better level. So those are kind of the changes that are happening in our programs. It has the benefits of it because it ensures we have sufficient workforce in the country, but it doesn't meet all the other factors that are going to enable us have the requisite health workforce in the system to offer the medical services. So it's a part of the question. How do we ensure the other bits are also met? Then there's a ramp-up focus on primary healthcare, and this has been witnessed through training of community health workers, paramedical students, and all that to offer emergency medicines. We have psychologists and counselors being trained in a number of programs, and even now there's Red Cross training that is underway. They're looking at recruiting individuals to learn for first aid in psychology. So these are things that are coming up. So the aim is have people who can offer the services at the very places where people live. So these are recent developments that are in the place and they are good. Contractual employment of doctors, having been employed on a contract where you earn third the salary that I mentioned. And then you're earning that third the salary, and at this very same time, you are not able to make the critical decision that you need to make. Probably you're not empowered. 2, you're in a facility where there are no equipment. Lighting is an issue. Probably you have a power outage that can last for 8 hours, and you have drugs in a refrigerator that need to be refrigerated all through, but you're not able to do that because there's no electricity, and you can't generate electricity from your phone to to power the generator, or even power the fridge. So those are things. Then there have been regulatory amendments. If you can remember, the first session that we had was on the Health Amendment Bill. With these regulatory amendments, they will influence how all the healthcare issues are handled. And if they influence them and there's no technical or oversight in terms of what we need to achieve as a country, then we'll be having shortfalls as end. So that is why we need as many people as possible to get engaged in terms of policies and regulatory issues to look at how we can influence the system. And influencing it is not influencing it to favor our interests as individuals. Look at my interest, the interest of the person next to me, and the entire society that depends on fully functioning and efficient healthcare systems. That when that's achieved, we are at a better position. Then recently we had the employment of the Cuban doctors. We had 100 a while back. Then now we had 20 that came in last week but one. So we are now importing doctors. The question that has been up on the media a number of times is, why do we have to employ 20 Cuban doctors, yet we have over 1,300 Kenyan doctors who are unemployed in the very country where we are importing others? We talk about the capacity building in terms of what they'll be sharing skills, knowledge transfer. It's good to transfer knowledge, but who are they transferring that knowledge if our doctors, some who are young, who would be able to be matched with them to gain that knowledge and ensure the sustainability in terms of delivering these services, are not employed? If it were my perspective would be, one, we have a Cuban doctor who is a specialist, as it is mentioned to us. We have no facts on whether they're qualified, specialized and all, but we believe they are because that is what we've been made to believe. So bring one specialist and attach them to a number of the junior medical doctors who are unemployed so that there's that skill transfer and these people are able to grow in their profession, learning from a specialist. But getting them on board with nobody to be attached to them specifically to ensure that knowledge transfer happens, we'll have them for a year, then another year we renew the contract again. Subsequently, we'll just keep renewing and importing more of them. What happens to our local workforce? What happens to our very people who need the services from people who can offer them to them? 20 doctors from Cuba will not treat 49 million Kenyans. How do we bridge the gap? So these are some of the modalities that we need to look into and question as individuals who want a better society for ourselves, a better society for the next generation of individuals, and looking at ensuring everybody can be healthy to achieve their optimal potential in whatever they do. So these are questions that we need to ask, and it's me and you to ask them. If we're not going to ask them, we are losing the battle. And we are losing it not only for us, but even for the subsequent generations that will come after us. Then what are the implications of this? If you don't have sufficient numbers of doctors, that is when you'll have a patient who is at a critical condition being rolled into an emergency unit, and there's nobody to attend to them. What happens? Chances are some will die in that emergency waiting room. Some of them will develop complications, and some might not even get the care. And that is when you'll feel like, for example, if there's a pregnant mother who wanted to deliver at that point and there was nobody to attend to them when they are brought to the emergency room, she either delivers and the child develops complications, asphyxiation, cerebral palsy, autism, anything can happen because of the complications at point of delivery. If they are positive for HIV, for example, there's a risk of infection for the kid and the newborn that is being delivered at that time. So there will be poor treatment outcomes when there are delays because of insufficient quantities of healthcare workers. Doctor burnout, when I'm exhausted and I can't think properly because I have to see 1,000 patients in a day, when the recommended standard I should be seeing 1,000 patients over like a month or so continuously, then that burnout I'm not able to cope. I'll get stressed. The next patient who comes, it's just a matter of jotting down what I think is an impression based on the initial symptoms they mentioned, and it's done. Are the patients getting the best quality of care? No. And everybody knows it's a no. But how do we make that difference? Immigration and shift to private practice. We'll have as many private practices thriving or even sprouting everywhere they are. They might have the best quality of care or they might have the worst. The only thing is, when they thrive, some of the public facilities are going to die because no doctor wants to work in a system where they're not appreciated, they're not empowered to make the right decision for what they trained for. Going to school for 7 years, then you're in a practice, and you can't do what you are supposed to do because you don't have the power to do it. People will shift. How does that affect the quality of care that others get? It's not the best. So those are some of the things that might happen. And even in such situations, who can afford those services? Because when you look at it in the private sector, the bottom line has to make sense. That is in the profit levels. The facility has to keep running based on the income that is generated. So if that is not being met, it means me as a common mwananchi who doesn't have a stable source of income at whichever location I am, will not be able to get the healthcare services because I can't afford them. Which insurance programs are there? Are they cushioning people? Am I able even to afford that private insurance? And then some of our doctors are leaving. At the outset of COVID, there were people who wanted to be taken out by other countries and all. US needed doctors, UK, Italy even. And some wanted to go, some maybe have gone, I'm not so sure. But these are things that are happening. And even now, as we are speaking, there's a relaxed visa package from the United Kingdom, UK. So if UK is relaxing their immigration policies for healthcare workers, then how many of our Kenyan doctors will go? Does it mean Kenyan people don't need the doctors in place to offer the services? They really do need the services. But at the same time, as I mentioned initially, I am David as an individual, a human being before I'm a doctor. I have a family who needs me to provide for them. I have a community where my relatives who look up to me and they want me to be able to support them where they need the help. If I'm not getting that financing from the employer in terms of salaries, then I'd rather get it from some other place and I meet these other obligations at that particular point. So what is the implication? Every other person will not be making it through. They'll be suffering, but it's because I also have to look at what is a priority to me. A patient coming to a hospital, their priority is to get the medical care. Me as an individual who has a family to take care of and to feed, I have to look out to ensure that they have the food they need. That is the most important thing for them. So what are the priorities at that point? And are we meeting them? Because when I'm able to take care of my people and my things, I'm able to offer the quality care that the patient needs, and I'm able to meet the universal healthcare coverage plan under the Big Four that the president feels is what we need. And as a citizenship, we have accepted that that is what we need. So we work towards it together. But if working with it with another part left out, it's not going to achieve its end goal. Increased morbidity and mortality, so many people not being treated the best way they can. They continue being sick. Productivity low from economic perspective. Some will die in the process. That is all going to mess our own ecosystem and our society. Skills and needs mismatch in certain circumstances might happen because, for example, somebody, for example, the Cuban doctors who were brought into the country, they are from their setting. They had systems that were working. Now you bring someone into the current context with no change in terms of our circumstances and equipping of facilities, and you expect them to deliver the same quality of care they were delivering at the other point in our setting. Will it work? Maybe yes, maybe not. But time will tell based on how things will turn out. But that is a risk as well. So you're deployed to a community where you can offer over the services. You don't even understand their context. So skills and the needs mismatch will always compromise on the care that patient receive. One, compromise access to care. Then when you access that care, the quality will not be as optimal as you would have wished for, or it might be, depending on the circumstances under which individuals are working. But then there is need to ensure we revamp our healthcare system, looking at the human resources for health component. So what are the next steps for me and you? Look at health workers as human beings with responsibility, because I've seen in the recent past, after the 20 Cuban doctors were coming in, Twitter discussions, so many people are like, you can go to a hospital and this doctor is employed to be in that public facility, but they have also a private clinic. How do I feed my family if I'm not able to cater for my bills in Nairobi? And then the very society that is going to judge that you're having another job, 2 jobs, or even 3 jobs at a particular time, looks at you as a doctor who is able to support them in that community when somebody's son is going to university or going to high school and needs some fee support. You are the doctor in the village, so you have to be able to support them. And you need to, not that you have to, but you want to, because that is why the whole community invested in you, to be there for them, and you're not able to. So those are some of the things that once we factor them and look at it in terms of how do we enable this person who has gotten to this level to be at their optimal level, to deliver the services we expect of them, because it's us as a society that expect the services from our doctors. Enable them to offer the services, and at the same time, support them in ensuring they are able to meet their own responsibilities and obligations in their livelihoods as human beings. Then we have to consider all the drivers of health workforce potential and capacity and strengthen them where there is need and how it should be done, with a wide range approach in terms of how do we ensure it's sustainable, how do we ensure it's at the best meeting the needs of every individual, because every individual needs access to healthcare services. So we attract the right people who have the passion and willingness to do the work. We train them the best way we can. After training them, we don't let that knowledge go to waste and the skill go to waste. Recruit them and employ them so that they're able to offer the services. Once they're recruited, empower them, give them the right tools of service, let them do the work. Give them the autonomy to make the right decisions when they feel they should be made. Don't let it be like we have to scale up 3 times or 4 times up the ladder before a decision is made, which even compromises on the ultimate outcome of that intervention that needed to be done. Retain them in the healthcare system by remunerating them the best way you can, motivating them, and giving them chance to grow in the profession. When there's room for growth, everybody wants to grow, people will be within the system. And deploy them where they are going to work. Deploy them in locations where services are going to be met. Some people might fear going to certain locations because they wonder, what other thing can I do in that location? And there's a case that I read about China, where they looked at it in terms of if somebody was being deployed to a local community setting, they looked at how do they cater for their housing costs, their arrangements in that location, so that at least they are comfortable. If somebody is staying in Nairobi, the conditions are different from what they would experience in Isiolo or in Siaya or in Kakamega, Busia, anywhere, Turkana. So how do you ensure at least with whichever place they go, they have a decent living? Not an expensive living, extravagant, but it's a decent living where they can meet their essentials. Probably they normally have video calls with people who they interact with and gain skills. Even the training programs as Zoom has come at this point. Do we have internet access in that locality where they're being deployed? How do they continue learning when they're there? How do they advance their skill? So these are some of the things that in the Chinese context they put in place. And so it was in India, not China, sorry for that. So in Indian context, they put in place some of these, and it helped them ensure they could meet that target of ensuring every locality had a specialist or a doctor who could offer the care the patients needed. Finally, we have to ramp up our engagement in discussion for the overall good of health systems, and we have to look at it not from a subjective point of view, but from an objective point of view, looking at what really needs to be. And once we know what needs to be, we work towards making that thing that we need to be come to place. We need a healthy society. That healthy society comes from access to healthcare services and products, from qualified, adequate number of healthcare workers. So what ensures we have the healthcare workers? We get them to be trained, we get them to be employed, and we get them to have the right facilities to be able to discharge their mandate at their places of work. When that is done, it will be a win for me, it will be a win for you, and every other person in the society who needs such kind of services. So I think that would be the best way we could approach the whole situation. So this was a quote that I got from the WHO framework. Healthcare workers are motivated by their vocation. We are passionate about doing our work, but we are also influenced by financial and non-financial incentives. Financial because we have responsibilities, non-financial incentives because everybody wants a good living condition and a good working environment. So we are influenced by financial and financial incentives, working conditions, and access to professional advancement opportunities. Nobody wants to stay stagnant. We all want to grow. So how do we grow? In the systems where we are supposed to deliver our impact. Thank you. So I'll hand back over to you, Hezron.
Thank you so much, David, for the insightful session. I'm sure that we've all learned something throughout the session. Yeah, so the floor is now open for questions. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand or text on the chat box. So maybe I can start with one. I have a question, David, concerning telemedicine. Do you think that it plays a role in helping the human resource for health in Kenya?
Telemedicine.
Yeah.
At this point in time, I think it has a role to play, and I believe it has a very huge role to play, especially when you're looking at it in terms of the deployment. Certain locations don't have access to specialist healthcare workers, and when they don't have access to the specialist healthcare workers, how do they get to reach out to them? Telemedicine has given us an option where you can call any doctor, contact them, have a video call from whichever location, provided you have access to a platform that has them. And that's why in the recent past, we've seen the number of companies and organizations that are coming up, establishing telemedicine services. So you'd call through, then you relayed from their call station, and that call station now refers you to a specialist who would take care of your medical needs. I think it's a way that's going to address these issues. And two, it would even cut down on the cost of employing a doctor in a healthcare facility unless it's necessary. This is my perspective. I have like, for example, I have where I stay, I can get a number of doctors on a panel, then get kind of like they're empaneled into my system, my platform. Then I get somebody to manage a call center. They'll be contacted, they'll offer the services. They get remunerated based on the number of consultations and the treatment outcomes for the patients, how they respond from that. Then I have a liaison or an engagement with another lab that in case there's need for testing or sample collection, they'll relay that. Then I have a pharmacy outlet that is going to deliver, for example, the online e-pharmacy model for the one that Medawa has in place. So such telemedicine, digital health solutions are coming into place, but they are not going to be the ultimate solution that we need. They will help, which is good, but beyond telemedicine, there's that kind of personal contact that you have with your doctor. There's that kind of like the physical assessment that comes in terms of medical practice. I believe Sadia, being you've been in practice for a while, you know, like there's that point when you interact with the clinician or you interact with your patient as a doctor, you can assess more than just what they convey through voice calls and even video calls. So that is something that still has to be catered for in certain situations. But I think it's a game changer. And whoever embraces it can make a difference looking at the end goal of ensuring every person has access to quality healthcare services when and where they need them. I hope I've answered you, Hezron. Then there's a question here. What happens to staff who work on contract basis for more than a year? So that is where we have concerns, because some doctors have been employed, but the contract is renewed based on whether your employer wants to. And now there's a lapse, because initially there was a contract that said if you had a contract for over 2 years in a particular organization, you automatically become an employed doctor. 2 years. At this point in time, some give you a 6-month contract, then you're left out for a month or 2 in between. So it means when you're coming back as a new employee again. The contract is like starting afresh. So will you ever get to the 1 year or 2 years that is required for you to be fully employed? Maybe not. So those are some of the things that need to be questioned. And then once they are questioned, we look at how do we ensure people can continue having them. So I hope I've answered you.
There's another question there.
Okay, there's another question. Which will be the best way to bridge the skills gap in medicine? The gap between the very experienced and the new practitioners is huge. Well, Yukobet, I agree with you. There is a gap in terms of the experience and the new practitioners. One, bridging the skills gap comes with the skills you acquire when you're practicing under someone knowing what's done. And that is when I talked about the training component. Do we have experience seeing how conditions are managed, or we read the theoretical aspect of it and we use that theory to pass exams and get into practice? The ideal would be, I understand the theory and the basis as to why something has to be done in a particular way. But other than doing that, I have to be working under a professional or a specialist who is doing the work. And then in the process, I get to know how to do the work and even understand the disease processes, the interventions that need to be put in place. So that is one, experiential learning, even during the training. Then post-experiential learning, when you get into the work environment, you need kind of an engagement. We normally have a 1-year internship, but the challenge that we have is because of our shortfalls in the overall healthcare system, we have shortfalls, and therefore, as an intern, you will end up at one point having to do work like you are a professional at that point in time. So you are taking charge at that place and you're doing the work, which is good because you're offering the services, but it's learning in the process of doing your job with nobody to guide you. So that knowledge transfer is not as seamless as it should be. So that is another thing that needs to be looked into. It's at the internship level. Who is your preceptor? How do they transfer that knowledge from, after having that experience, how do they transfer that knowledge to you as a junior medical doctor coming into practice with them? So like experiential learning in school, then skills transfer at the point of preceptorship, internship, and even when you're starting your work. And then it doesn't lie with only the senior doctors. It even comes from the point of, as a junior doctor who is a new practitioner in the field, are you willing to learn? Are you pushing yourself to get to know more about your area of work? If you're not pushing yourself to get to know what needs to be known, then you'll be failing the profession and you're failing yourself, because as a doctor, there are certain things that you need to know, but you can't know them while you sit back and watch as things unfold. So that is another thing. So even the junior practitioners, the junior doctors need to take the challenge and move to the point of wanting to help the patients. And when you want to help a patient, you'll read more of the theory, because after 7 years of learning, you don't master everything in your mind. So you'll go back to review the case. After reviewing the case, you get to learn with a specialist who transfers the knowledge to you, if they are accessible. So they should be accessible as well, but you also have to reach out to them. So those are some of the things that I feel can bridge the gap. And even the case that we are looking at now that I mentioned about the Cuban doctors, having a pairing system where it's kind of a tutorship. In tutorship, you have someone learning from another in an arrangement that is structured, and there's progression and metrics to determine whether they are achieving those targets or not. So those are some of the things that I feel we can put in place, and we can advocate for to be in place if they are not really in place yet, and we don't have the power to put them in place where we are. Any other person who might be having a question or concern?
David, there's Francis Ondicho on Facebook, though he's just asking for the slides after the presentation.
It's okay. Whoever needs the slides, you can reach out to us on email, and whoever registered, you'll have access to them because I have your email addresses and we'll relay them to you. So our email is info.reculture@gmail.com. It's here being shown now. So you can just send an email mentioning you need the slides and we'll send them to you. Any other question? Quack doctors and Google doctors. Well, we have quacks, that's for sure. And we also have the Google doctors, where everything you read from Google is factual information. Quacks, having them in practice is not the best thing that should be, but they have been in practice because of our shortfalls in terms of regulatory frameworks. Do we know how many facilities are operating? As a pharmacist, this is one thing I can tell you. I know we are regulated by the Pharmacy and Poisons Board, but there are people who are dealing in pharmaceutical products without the right licensing, and regulatory issues have been there. And as individuals who are in part of this forum, you already know, even a number of times we hear media covering like the number of shutdowns and all that by the Pharmacy and Poisons Board. Why are these quacks thriving in their work? One, for let's say, for example, the pharmacy system, the public doesn't even get to know what the pharmacy should be, the quality of service they expect from the pharmacist, and it's a trade. And people want to pay their bills and make their money. That's one. Two, in terms of the quack doctors, probably you get to a facility and the government facility and there are no services. The private, they might be expensive, and the quack comes in to be the bridge between no services from the public or not enough services as you would want to, and the expensive from the private that are kind of high end. So they get their way. And as a society, we've normalized it because we don't care which services and where we are getting those services. As you mentioned, quack doctors, there's something that came to my mind. There's a guy that was reported last year, but one, I think 2018, 2017, Mugo Wairimu in Githurai. And it was known because he was sexually abusing the clients who are majorly women. And when you look at some of the stories that came out, these were people, at times they went to procure abortion, which is illegal at that point, especially even now, there are provisions on how, under law, on how it should be done. But are we willing to go to the right processes? No. So it gives the quack a way to offer the service that you really need as an individual in the society. So as a society, if we look at it in terms of, yes, these are services that the society needs, but we under the provisions of the law, these are the facilities that can provide them, and this is how they provide them. And we seek them from those places. Ensure people are informed about where they can access them. That is a win. For the Google doctors, I don't know how it works, but then I know this. I am an individual, probably, let's say, if I was just a layman, I have symptoms, I'll Google them and get to know the drugs that I need to go get. I'll go buy them. It's not the best way because different clinical conditions present with almost related symptoms. Now we have coronavirus coming with difficulty in breathing, coming with issues on headache and all. Headache comes with malaria, comes with pneumonia, partly it comes with typhoid. So if you look at headache as a symptom of a condition, you'll go for anything and anything that makes sense to you at that point. How do you know that? That is one. Two, all these other information that you get from Google, it's a multitude of information. So who wants to refine that information? That's where we have the aspect of, there's aspect on referencing and the reference materials that are normally recommended for doctors that we have. So when we review a patient, you look at the prevailing circumstances. For example, you have a condition where in this community, the water supply system has an issue. So chances are there might be a risk of contamination of the water system. And when that happens, when people present with, let's say, headache, stomach discomfort and all, chances are it might be typhoid or amoeba. So that is what kind of the clinical diagnosis that you make an inference based on the circumstances that are around and making treatment. So that is a good thing. But at the same time, in terms of the Google doctors, there are the doctors that we have who look for the symptoms and make the deductions at their own personal level without doing the due diligence to know much of the information. So as individuals, as the public one, there's no point that you have the right to diagnose yourself and procure your medicines for yourself. And it's not something that I know you can take up today. That is one thing we have to acknowledge. You need to make that change. Because even me at a personal level, there are times that I have people close to me, instead of even getting to consult me, they buy medicines and use them. That is when they'll tell you, by the way, I had kind of a headache and I bought antimalarials. And that person has never traveled out of Nairobi, where is that, which is not an high risk area for malaria. They've been in the same place for a long time. So what's the risk of malaria? Then after a period of a week or two, you realize the symptoms didn't go away, so they get another antibiotic now. So these are issues that are happening. You need to get to seek clinical guidance from a practitioner. And as practitioners who are in the house or whichever practitioner you interact with, give the right information and make your clinical inferences with the patient in mind as an individual and not just a client you're pushing over, like you're moving blocks of building blocks. That is two. The last thing, as patients, whenever we get to a hospital, the people we love getting to hospitals, they need to take an active role and get to know more information. If you ask the doctor why they are treating you with a particular drug, they'll have to know why. And that means they'll give you a justification. And if it wasn't the right justification, you will have pushed them, meaning after that interaction, they'll go learn more about it. It holds them accountable as doctors, it holds us accountable as doctors, and at the same time, it ensures the quality of care you receive is optimal. Because they'll kind of hold back, wait, I might be lying to this patient, and probably they know, they don't know, but I don't want to make that mistake. So who wins? Everybody wins when we hold each other accountable as a society, but don't diagnose yourself, don't prescribe medicines for yourself. And even when you go to the pharmacies and everything, for the pharmacists and the pharmaceutical practitioners working in the chemists or pharmacies, there's nothing that prevents you from dispensing a drug that you feel is not the right drug for that condition. You have to take responsibility and take charge of your profession and your role. Play it. I hope I've answered you, Yukabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Hezron, I'm back to you.
So I think we should now be finishing up because time is not on our side. And I'd like to thank you all for being part of this session today. For those on Facebook also, thank you so much. Dr. David, thank you so much for the insightful session today. And I hope that we've all learned something out of this. So we're going to share the video on our YouTube platform. So if you'd like to share with your friends or colleagues, you can have the link later on. So we're also going to be having the next session of the Health Roundup series next week. So we're looking forward to have you. So thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity. And thank you everyone for being part of this discussion. It's been a pleasure. And I hope we make a difference in our healthcare system by doing the right thing when it needs to be done. Asanteni.